In the name of God, peace everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of this case study on how assumed conclusions shape the interpretation of the polysemous root Dad Ra Ba. In part 1 of this case study, we established an important principle. It is tempting to assume that once we open the Quran, the calibration problem simply disappears, that the text speaks for itself and sincere readers will naturally arrive at the same conclusions. But that isn't what we find. The calibration problem doesn't disappear when the revelation enters the equation. If anything, it becomes even more difficult to recognize. Readers do not approach the Quran as blank slates. They bring assumptions, values, priorities, and moral intuitions that quietly shape how the text is understood. Whether those assumptions come from inherited religious tradition or from modern Western sensibilities, they function as an upstream calibration through which revelation is interpreted. That raises the central question we will explore throughout this case study. When we think we are interpreting the Quran, are we really allowing the Quran to calibrate us? Or have we already calibrated the Quran to ourselves? If you haven't watched my The Calibration Problem videos, I would encourage you to do so. The three-part series shows why our downstream conclusions depend on what we have programmed ourselves to optimize. Also, check out my Substack channel to read the accompanying article, the link to which is provided in the description below. Let's begin. Before we move into the case study, let's briefly revisit two ideas that everything from this point onward depends upon. The first is this: facts do not interpret themselves. What we call facts or evidence are already interpretations of observations. In this study, those observations are the textual data of the Quran. But before we ever reach a conclusion, that textual data passes through our calibration, our assumptions, values, worldview, and prior commitments. That calibration determines what we notice, what we emphasize, and ultimately what we accept as true. The second idea is polysemy. A lexical root may legitimately possess multiple related meanings. That richness is one of the strengths of the Arabic language. Different grammatical constructions, contexts, metaphors, and idioms allow the language to express a wide range of ideas. But there is an equally important boundary. Polysemy is not a license for unlimited interpretation. It does not give a carte blanche to interpret the text that protects the interpreter's own calibration bias. The existence of multiple lexical possibilities does not give us permission to choose whichever meaning best supports the conclusion we already prefer. The text itself determines which meaning is licensed. Morphology, grammar, syntax, immediate context, and above all, the Quran's own internally coherent pantextual usage. Meaning is therefore derived from the text, not imposed upon it. Everything in this case study will simply be an application of these two principles. Before we begin the analysis, we need to establish the rules of engagement. Every investigation must start with a clearly defined methodology. Otherwise, the rules have a tendency to change whenever the evidence becomes uncomfortable. For this case study, I'll be examining a detailed article from Quran434.com that challenges the traditional understanding of the root Dwad Rabba in verse 434. The article argues that because the root has multiple meanings, the meaning to strike should be considered the least preferable. Underlying that argument is a moral intuition that a merciful God would not command such an action, and therefore other lexical possibilities should be prioritized. That is a perfectly understandable concern. But concern alone cannot determine lexical meaning. As we established in Part 1, virtues cannot dictate lexical analysis on their own. If a particular interpretation is to be preferred because it better reflects divine mercy, that correspondence with the text must first be demonstrated through the language itself, not assumed before the analysis even begins. That is the standard I will apply consistently across this study. Before we examine the evidence, I'd like to make my own calibration explicit. The scope of this study is limited strictly to the Qur'an. I won't appeal to post hoc explanations attributed to the Prophet to resolve textual difficulties, nor will I interpret the Quran through the lens of modern secular ideologies or provisional scientific theories. Although these approaches appear very different, they occupy opposite ends of the same calibration spectrum. One privileges inherited narratives, the other privileges contemporary narratives. In this study, I will do neither. Instead, I will allow the Quran to function as its own explanatory framework, applying the same methodology consistently from beginning to end. Only then can we fairly evaluate whether an interpretation is being derived from the text or whether it is being imposed upon it. The objective here isn't to compromise with the prevailing consensus. It's to remain aligned with the calibration standard established by the text itself and trust that its wisdom often becomes apparent only in hindsight. Before we look at a single verse, I'd like to make one commitment. The purpose isn't to defend a predetermined conclusion. It's to apply a methodology that remains fixed throughout the analysis. Every occurrence of the root will be evaluated using exactly the same criteria: its morphology, its syntax, its grammar, its immediate context, and its relationship to the rest of the Quran through a pantextual reading. The methodology doesn't change simply because the result becomes inconvenient. That's an essential safeguard against confirmation bias. If a principle is valid for one occurrence of the root, then it must be valid for every occurrence. The rules cannot change halfway through the investigation. Only a fixed hermeneutic gives us confidence that the interpretation is being derived from the text, rather than the text being reshaped to fit our preferred conclusion. At this point, it's worth stepping back and asking what this investigation is really trying to accomplish. On the surface, it may appear that we are simply debating the root dad ra ba can mean. But that's not the real question. The deeper question is whether the Quran itself is resistant to semantic manipulation when its own linguistic constraints are allowed to govern the interpretation. In other words, is the text robust enough to prevent us from making it say whatever we want? Throughout this study, I'll argue that it is. The Quran is not a flexible tool that bends to the interpreter's preferences. It's a fixed standard. Its morphology, syntax, grammar, context, and pantextual coherence work together as safeguards against semantic inflation and semantic laundering. So the purpose of this case study is not merely to catalog the meanings of a lexical root. It is to demonstrate that the Quran itself is tamper-resistant, that when its own interpretive rules are applied consistently, they constrain the range of legitimate interpretations and protect the text from being reshaped to fit our prior assumptions. Before we begin applying the methodology, I want to separate 4 questions that are too often collapsed into one. First, what is the semantic field of the disputed lexical item within the Quran itself? In other words, before importing possibilities from elsewhere, how does the Quran actually use it? Second, what grammatical, syntactic, and contextual constraints govern its meaning in each occurrence? Polysemy gives us possibilities, but the construction determines which possibilities are actually licensed. Third, given those constraints, which meaning best explains the disputed lexical item locally? Only after establishing the semantic field and the linguistic constraints do we approach the verse under dispute. But there is one final step, and this is crucial. We then take that proposed meaning and backtest it across the corpus. Does it reduce global explanatory friction, or does preserving it force us to reinterpret other verses, invent exceptions, or change our rules along the way? This is where the principle of coherence in verse 482 becomes operational. Taken together, these 4 stages function as a semantic tamper-resistance detector. The approach is falsifiable, and interpretation must survive both the local linguistic evidence and the global corpus. So now, let's apply that methodology to the polysemous root Dwad Rabba and ask what Wadrabehunna naturally means in verse 434. Before we begin analyzing individual verses, we first need to understand the dataset. The root Dwad Rabba appears 58 times in the Quran, 55 as a Form 1 verb and 3 as a verbal noun. This table is the complete dataset for the investigation. Every occurrence of the root has already been identified, classified, and grouped according to its licensed Quranic construction. Notice something important. Although Dwad Rabba is unquestionably a polysemous root, the Quran doesn't use it in an unlimited number of ways. When every occurrence is examined contextually, its semantic range is constrained to just 13 licensed constructions and meanings. That's why claims that the root has 100 different meanings miss the point. For this investigation, dictionaries and hypothetical possibilities are secondary. Our concern is much simpler. How does the Quran itself use this root? Once that data set is established, every subsequent interpretation becomes testable against it. The data comes first. The conclusions come second. Now let's step back and look at the overall pattern emerging from the dataset. One thing becomes apparent almost immediately. The meaning of Daraba is not determined by the lexical root alone. It's determined by the grammatical environment in which the root appears. Its syntax, its prepositions, its direct objects, idiomatic constructions, and its immediate context. That's exactly what each row in this infographic represents. Each row is a distinct grammatical construction that licenses a particular semantic function. Let's begin with the section highlighted in red on the left. Look at rows 1 through 5. Whether it's striking with a staff in verse 260, 7:160, and 26:63, striking with the feet in 24:31, creating a path through the sea in 2077, striking a human object in verse 434, 812, 850, and 4727, or striking an object in verse 273 and 3844, nothing in these grammatical constructions licenses a departure from the root's default lexical sense of physical striking or impact. Together, these 5 rows account for 12 verbal occurrences. Then notice the nominal derivatives at the bottom. These include forms such as Durban in verse 3793, striking with his right hand. These nominal constructions likewise denote acts of physical striking rather than introducing new semantic meanings. Now shift your attention to the green section on the right. This is where the meanings begin to change. But notice what hasn't changed. The lexical root is still dwad ra ba. What changes is the grammatical construction surrounding it. Different prepositions, different objects, different idiomatic expressions, and different syntactic environments license different semantic extensions. That simple observation becomes the governing principle for the rest of our investigation. Now let's focus on the 2 most significant constructions in the green section of the table. Begin with row 2. Here we have daraba masalan, which occurs 30 times throughout the Quran. It means to present, set forth, or coin a parable or example. Notice what's happening here. The idiomatic meaning doesn't come from the root dad ra ba alone. It's licensed by the complete construction, where the direct object masalan gives the expression its established meaning. Now move up to row 1. Here we find daraba fil ard, which appears 5 times as a verb and once as a noun in verse 273 for a total of 6 occurrences. In this construction, the expression means to travel, journey, or go forth through the land. Once again, the meaning isn't carried by the lexical root in isolation. It's the preposition fi that forms the established collocation and licenses the semantic transition from striking to traveling. The same principle applies to row 9 for darbar riqab. Functions as a complete battlefield idiom. Read together with verse 867, its resultant meaning is decisive battlefield subjugation. But that meaning belongs to the complete construction. It cannot be detached from the idiom assigned to Dawad Rabah in isolation and then imported into another grammatical construction. These rows illustrate the same governing principle. The semantic extension belongs to the grammatical construction, not to the lexical root by itself. And that's why the meanings to present an example or to travel cannot simply be detached from their own constructions and imported into other verses where those grammatical cues are absent. They are functioning as idioms in the text. Now let's turn to the remaining non-literal constructions shown on the right side of the infographic. In row 3, the expression Duribat alayhimuzillah appears in verse 261 and twice in verse 3112. This is not an idiom in the same sense as daraba masalan. Here, daraba is being used figuratively to convey the force or impact of an abstract condition, humiliation being imposed on them. English works in a similar way. We might say that someone was struck by grief or gripped by fear. No one imagines a literal physical blow. The action verb gives vivid force to an emotional or existential state. Then, in row 4, we have Fadarabna ala azanihim in verse 1811, the sense of placing a barrier over their hearing or shutting it off. In row 5, Afanadrebu ankumuz zikr appears in verse 43:5, meaning, Shall we turn the reminder away from you? Here, the preposition un redirects the force of the verb toward withdrawal or removal. In row 6, the expression ma darabuhu laka illa jadalan appears in verse 4358. This is a rhetorical construction referring back to the example introduced in the preceding verse 4357. The sense is not physical striking, but presenting something for argument or disputation. In row 7, وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُورِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ appears in verse 2431, drawing or laying their covering over their bosoms. And finally, in row 8, فَضُرِبَ بَيْنَهُمْ بِسُورٍ appears in verse 5713, a wall being created or set up between two groups. So as the viewer moves down these rows from verse 261 and 3112 through 1811, 43.5, 43.58, 24.31, and 57.13, the same governing principle remains intact. The non-literal meaning is always licensed by the complete grammatical construction and its immediate context. So before we ask what wadribuhunna means in verse 434, we have already established the first rule of interpretation. We do not begin with dictionaries. We begin with the grammatical construction that the Qur'an itself has chosen. That brings us naturally to the next stage of our investigation, the grammatical analysis of the root dwad ra ba. We have now established the semantic range of dwad ra ba. The next question is more precise. How does grammar control which meaning is activated in each verse? This table gives us a bird's eye view of that grammatical system. The important point is that prepositions, direct objects, and instrumental particles are not decorative additions. They are doing the actual interpretive work. They function as structural markers that either preserve the default meaning of physical striking or license a departure from it. Begin with row 1. Here, daraba appears as a direct transitive verb followed by a direct object. In verses such as 434, 812, 850, and 4727, the action passes directly from the verb to the person being acted upon. There is no proposition, idiomatic object, or specialized construction redirecting the meaning. So the default lexical sense of physical striking or bodily impact is retained. Now look at row 2. Here the verb is followed by the instrumental particle be. The function of be is to introduce the instrument or means by which the action is performed. In verses 260, 160, and 2663, the instrument is the staff. In verse 2431, it may be the feet or the garment. In verse 3844, it is the bundle. The construction itself remains stable. Verb plus instrument. But the nature of the instrument and the surrounding context determine whether the action is a direct strike or a broader physical application, such as drawing a garment over the body. Now move to the green section. In row 3, the preposition fi combines with the verb in the expression daraba fi al-ard. Here, fi is not simply adding location. It forms part of an established collocation, meaning to travel or go forth through the land. The semantic shift is licensed by the complete construction. The same is true in row 5, where the preposition ala redirects the construction towards something being imposed upon a person, as in humiliation being laid or struck upon them. And in row 8, the preposition an redirects the force of the verb away from something, producing the meaning of turning aside or withholding the reminder. Direct objects can also license specialized meanings. In row 4, the object masal forms the fixed expression daraba masalan to set forth a parable or comparison. The verb does not independently mean to cite. That meaning arises from the verb and its object functioning together as an idiomatic construction. By contrast, in row 7, the object tariqan, meaning a path defining the result of the action, creating or opening a route through the sea, that meaning is also corroborated by the wider Qur'anic context, where Moses is explicitly commanded to strike the sea with his staff. So grammar does not merely accompany meaning, it constrains it. A direct object may preserve the default lexical sense, as in striking a person. A preposition may redirect the action toward travel, imposition, or withdrawal. And a particular object may combine with the verb to form a fixed idiomatic expression. These constructions are the licensing mechanisms that prevent the 58 occurrences of dad ra ba from becoming semantically chaotic. We have now examined every occurrence of the root dad ra ba in the Quran. And the evidence points to a single, remarkably consistent conclusion. The meaning of the verb is not determined by the lexical root alone. It's determined at the level of the grammatical construction. The lexical root provides the core semantic potential, but it is the surrounding construction, the prepositions, the direct objects, the fixed collocations, the idiomatic expressions, and the immediate context that licenses the meaning we ultimately derive. This explains why the same root can legitimately describe travel, presenting a parable, covering, turning away, setting up a barrier, or imposing humiliation, while still preserving a coherent semantic system. The important implication is this. The apparent polysemy of dad ra ba is not transferable. A meaning licensed in one grammatical construction cannot simply be detached from that construction and imported into another verse where those linguistic cues are absent. We have now completed the first two stages of the investigation: the Quranic semantic field and the grammatical constraints governing it. We now have a control against which competing interpretation of verse 434 can be tested. In part 3, we apply stages 3 and 4, testing the proposed meanings locally and then back-testing them across the corpus for global explanatory friction. This brings us to the end of part 2 of this case study. In the next presentation, I do a complete lexical analysis of the article Quran 434. Thank you for watching.